we've come back from the pandemic, as parish historian, I'm Bill Hyland, we've always been so interested in the diversity of St. Bernard and what it is that makes St. Bernard something separate and distinct from any other place in the metropolitan New Orleans area. And it has to do with the cultural legacies which so many people have left here. And so, as we develop on that thought, we have to then begin to look at a group of people who have been really underserved and in many respects misrepresented and really not given their just due. And these are the people who descend from the enslaved Africans who began coming to Louisiana in the 1720s when we were French. It was determined by the French, who were from Quebec in what is today Canada, and also from France in Europe, that they just were incapable of carving any kind of civilization as they knew it, as a European knew it, from this wilderness. So they first tried enslaving Native Americans. But apparently our ancestors were riddled with disease, and of course the poor Native Americans were not equipped. They had not been exposed to many of these diseases, so they began dying. And so then the determination was made to start bringing people from West Africa. And of course it's one of those terrible episodes in our history, and yet as terrible as it was, and it can never be justified, nevertheless, the presence of the enslaved African people coming together with the Native Americans and Western Europeans forged what we call, or what I call, an identité créole, a Creole identity culturally and in terms of our heritage. So tonight, we are going to learn about a colony, a freedmen's colony, which was established after the American Civil War. We've heard for many years about Fazanville at the Chalmette battlefield. And it's true, but so far as we know, that was the very first of the freedmen's colonies established to house formerly enslaved African people and to give them a way of transitioning from life as enslaved people on plantations to freedom. And Fazanville was a very successful experiment. But unfortunately, in the early 1960s, in the same time that Treme in New Orleans was destroyed by building the expressway on Claiborne Avenue that's there now, in the same period when the United States government was thinking about building a riverfront expressway in front of Jackson Square, and in order to make it more historically appealing, to put cast iron on the raised riverfront expressway as it passed in front of Jackson Square. This was the mindset of the United States in the 1960s. So, of course, you know, Fazanville was destroyed in order to expand the Chalmette battlefield, and then the Isleño fishing village of Shell Beach was destroyed in order to build the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, the Mr. Go, the very thing that the federal government gave us that largely destroyed St. Bernard and Betsy in 1965 and did destroy St. Bernard completely in Katrina. So Fazanville fell victim to that phenomenon. But very happily, we have one major intact freedmen's colony existing to the present, and it's called Verrettville. And it's been my great pleasure and privilege to know many people from Verrettville. I remember as a little boy, Samuel Smith, he was called Mr. Kibbe, I called him Mr. Kibbe, and he could do anything. You needed a house built, he built it. You needed a tomb built, he built it. Whatever you needed, he did for you, and he did it with the greatest standards. And for instance, you know, there were many years that I spent time in the home of Frank Fernandez, our first parish historian, who was a career educator. And that house was built by Mr. Kibbe. So, you know, we all felt very close to him, and there have been so many Verrettville people who have been so important. So what we're going to do now is just look at a few slides. So I think we can begin now. That is the, You know me, and I'm a dinosaur. You do know that. Can you advance it up there? There we go. This, we are told, is a photograph made by Clarence John Laughlin about 1945 of the original church at Verrettville. This was the original church built in 1871 by the first Samuel Smith, about whom you will hear tonight, as well as others. Now let's see if I can. This is the modern church. And what had happened, you could see it's brick. The wooden church had just become racked. It was in terrible condition. It was built in 1871 or thereabouts. And so Sam Smith's grandson, Mr. Kibbe, built this church, and he actually raised money with Manuel Molero and other people, and with that money, he was able, with help from others, to build the church. And then here you see the historic marker that we put up in 2016. This was our first effort to really mark a site of great significance to the African history, American history of St. Bernard Parish. And here we talk about Samuel Smith, whom you'll hear more about.
Community in St. Bernard Parish traces its roots back to a freed slave fighting in the Civil War and the message he says he received from God. Reverend Samuel Smith dedicated his life to helping freed slaves navigate the Reconstruction era.
Maddie Kurtz shares the story of Verrett's first Baptist church on this Juneteenth holiday.
There's more than a century of history tucked between the pews of the First Baptist Church in Verrett. The church stands as a beacon for the community, over 150 years old. Chronicles passed down through generations.
What they see going on now, it haven't always been this way. I need them to know that.
The story starts in the late 1800s with Reverend Samuel Smith, a former slave freed by the Emancipation Proclamation.
Juneteenth is a one-day celebration, but it wasn't a one-day event.
Samuel Smith was born into slavery. He worked on the Proctor plantation in what is now Shell Beach.
He never had to cut cane or anything. He was the yard boy. Took care of the livestock.
When New Orleans was captured in 1862, he enlisted in the Union Army and passed down through generations a story of coming face to face on that battlefield with his former slave master who was shot and injured.
Had to make a decision. Help him out and let him go or kill him.
And in that moment, he spoke to God and chose mercy.
And he said, I'm gonna let you go back home. And he said, I want you to organize and build me a church. Those were the words that were spoken to my great-grandfather by God Almighty. He did that.
First Baptist Church was born, and it didn't always look like this. Come hell and Katrina high waters, this is the third building to house worship. And for the newly freed slave and his parishioners, the mile-and-a-half property came at a cost.
$300. And it took them 10 years to pay it off.
The community is still functioning today. Garland Sanchez, Reverend Raymond Smith's brother-in-law, remembers how different things were growing up. He says in Verrett, everyone is family.
Anyone could chastise or correct you. If you did something down the street and you got a whipping from someone, don't tell your mama, because you're going to get another whipping for not listening. That's instilled, and I'd like to pass that to my children and the future generations.
Reverend Smith remembers being a teenager when his father led the fast-growing congregation. He baptized 52 people in one day using the bayou water from the canal across the street, and later 42 more at one time.
Watch my dad dip every one of them. Every one of them. Baptize all of them. That was the two largest baptismal services that was ever held in St. Bernard Parish. right here in First Baptist Church.
While the founding parishioners are dead and buried in the cemetery behind the church, their descendants still find their way home on Sundays.
Even if they don't come to this church, they still come to the community to meet with family and have dinner.
God bless you all. Amen.
Through the decades, the church evolves. Sunday services now live streamed on Facebook, but through the culture bearers of Lower St. Bernard Parish.
So I'd like to take that history and move towards the future, to build on it, and hopefully others can learn and move forward.
At the young age of 85, Reverend Raymond Smith looks ahead to the day he passes the legacy of his ancestors to the next church leader.
Well, my time is getting short and short. I'll soon be stepping down. I don't know who the next pastor will be, but he'll become the pastor, or she, whoever it be, will become the greatest church, or one of the greatest churches in the state of Louisiana. Hallelujah. Yes, ma'am.
So Reverend Samuel Smith went on to help his community even further, being elected to the police jury, the school board, and as Justice of the Peace. His great-grandson says all are welcome to their home off Bayou Road on Sundays. Liz.
So we did that this year for Juneteenth. I had a call from Kenny Kurth, Maddie's father, saying, my daughter is desperate to find a topic for Juneteenth. And I said, I have just the topic for you. So Raymond Smith and Garland were so kind to cooperate. And so now this is a good way for me to introduce Garland Sanchez. He's a native of St. Bernard, a native of Verrettville. His ancestors were formerly enslaved people who helped to found Verrettville. He attended St. Bernard Parish schools, but was graduated from St. Augustine High School in New Orleans. He attended the University of Southwest Louisiana in Lafayette. He moved to Minnesota for 25 years. He returned to Verrettville about 13 years ago, and he lives there with his wonderful wife, Gladys Stewart Sanchez, who is a great-great-granddaughter of Samuel Smith. So you see, just as we're all related in the Isleño community, the Verrettville people are all related, and I also have to tell you that many of the Verrettville people are related to all of us. So we really are one big community. So tonight, Garland's going to come up here, and he is going to share with you some information about Verrettville. And, you know, the only thing I'm going to say is this. You know, it's a tragedy that we lost Fazanville. And it's important never to forget what happened there, because history forgotten is history repeated. But it's also so important for us to celebrate what we still have. And I can think of no greater partisan and ambassador for Verrettville and the black heritage of St. Bernard Parish than Garland Sanchez. So thank you so much. And Garland, if you'll come up. And you know, Garland says he doesn't like to speak publicly, but he is a natural. And you know, we have his mother right here.
Well, good evening. I just want to let you all know I am not a public speaker. Hopefully I can share some of what I researched, some of what I learned, and if you have any questions or want to add anything, feel free to stop me. So before we get into the Patriots, let's do a little history. In 1808, importing slaves to the United States was banned. Now, you could still sell slaves domestically. So the slave trade was ended, but slavery didn't. The Emancipation Proclamation was in 1865. President Lincoln freed 3,500 slaves in Washington, D.C., only Washington, D.C. There were over 500,000 slaves in the border states around Washington, D.C. The Emancipation Proclamation did not include the states that bordered the Confederate states. So Missouri, Delaware, Maryland, and Kentucky did not have to abide by the Emancipation Proclamation. The 13th Amendment is what actually ended slavery. The 13th Amendment needed 37 states to be ratified into law. It was only a bill, only an idea, until they got 35 states to ratify it. They didn't have 35 states at the time. More than 500,000 people were enslaved in the border states. Total in the country at the time was 3.5 million enslaved people. In 1861, General Benjamin Butler, a general in the Union Army, enacted, well, let's back up a little. 3 enslaved people ran away from their plantation to the military post. This was in Virginia. They met with General Butler and explained their situation. General Butler then decided, because they were considered property, and this is the language used in the Confederacy, that that property could be confiscated because it was an insurrection against the United States. He then confiscated the property, those people, and freed them. Once that story got out, tens of thousands of people escaped to military posts so that they could be freed. One of those, and the reason he did, was Pa Sam, Samuel Smith. He ran away from the plantation, the Proctor Plantation in St. Bernard Parish, went to New Orleans, to the military post, and enlisted in the Union Army, thereby being freed. There were others who did the same thing, one of whom was my great-great-great-grandfather. Another was Jacob Hamilton, who escaped from the plantation, joined the Union Army, and came back to Verrettville as the blacksmith. Henry Stewart was another. So as we do research, there's many who followed this procedure to be freed. Juneteenth was in 1865. The general went into Galveston, Texas, came in through the port because Galveston is a port city, and announced that slaves were free. They didn't have to be slaves anymore. There were many other caveats and stipulations with it. You still had to work, you had to have a job. So because you were formerly a slave and that's all you knew, most didn't leave the plantation. The census for the Galveston area showed that there was about 7,000 people living in Galveston. That announcement freed about 1,200 people. Texas had over 250,000 enslaved people. So even though it's a federal holiday and there's a lot of publicity around Juneteenth, Juneteenth didn't do what we thought or what we commonly think it did. The Emancipation Proclamation was just that, a proclamation. Basically, I would like you to free your slaves. There was not a way to enforce it. The slaves in the outposts, basically west of the Mississippi, Texas, and some of the southern states, did not abide. The border states didn't have to abide and definitely didn't. And although we may think of the dirty South or the good North, the bad South, were the last outposts, they weren't. The last states to abolish slavery were actually Union states. And they were Delaware and Kentucky. Right, so based on that, the story is Samuel Smith, at 16 years old, fled the Proctor Plantation. He went to the Customs House and joined the Union Army. This was in 1863, so before the proclamation. He went to the battlefield, and he was a storied soldier. He met on the battlefield his captor, got in a position where he could kill him, and the Lord spoke to him. He had a choice, kill him or let him free. The Lord told him, set him free and let him go back home. When Sam Smith came back home after being directed by the Lord to start a church, he did. Members of the community helped raise money to build that first church. First Baptist Church was established in 1871. Thaddeus Jones, who's the great-grandfather of Simon Blaze, did the same, joined the military and was freed. Also, out of the Verrettville and surrounding area, let's again back up a little bit. Most of the communities, towns in St. Bernard, are former plantations, and they keep that same name. So Verret was a plantation, Contreras was a plantation, Joda, all of that was plantations. As you got along the river, Faisantville, all plantations. They used the river for transportation to bring their product to New Orleans. Reverend Sam Smith, or Pa Sam, was also on the police jury. He was a part of the St. Bernard Governing Authority. He was also a justice of the peace. The jail, which he could only arrest people of color, is said to be on the property that his great-great-granddaughter now owns and lives on in Verret. Another member of the village who joined the military to be freed was Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart ran away, or was born in Maryland. He ran away from the plantation, joined the Union Army, and came back to St. Bernard in 1869. Mr. Stewart's family still resides in St. Bernard and in its surrounding parishes. The oldest son, Thomas Stewart, married Mary Fisher, who's a prominent St. Bernard family, the Fishers. Elizabeth, known as Lizzie, married Jesse Baptiste, and they lived in Joda, another plantation near Verret. The people of Joda would walk to Verret, which is 1.5 miles to go to First Baptist Church. During the Great Depression, Jesse and Liz took their younger sister, Louise Stewart, into their home. Louise Stewart married Antoine Dorsey, who years later, during World War I, was a veteran. He worked in the French Quarter, lived in New Orleans, but always kept their membership at First Baptist Church. Henry Stewart, the grandson of Thomas, the younger brother of Lizzie, also joined the military. He was led by Pastor Smith, tall, slender man, very, very, very fit. He labored on the Contreras plantation. With the outbreak of World War I, the US government was inducting people, so a draft. And he was assigned as a pioneer military company, or C for colored. He had a distinguished military history. Thomas received several promotions while in France, and he obtained the rank of sergeant. His company was recognized as a distinguished company in battle. His regiment in France was there for 9 months. He was transported back to the United States, where his troops arrived in New Jersey and transported to Camp Shelby in Mississippi. He was paid $119 for back pay for the entire time he served. Another person from the Verret village that joined the military was Charlie Goodman. He grew up in Joda. By 1917, he was back and worked at the Breakaway Sugar Company in Plaquemine. Charlie was inducted into the military, also went to Camp Pike in Arkansas, and was assigned as an engineer, a colored engineer, in the Service Battalion, 525. Both Charlie and Mr. Thomas served in service units. These service units were created by the United States military at the beginning of World War I for primarily African American inductees. They were non-combatant units, but they did go above and beyond in the fight for our freedom. At the passing of Samuel Smith in 1927, his son-in-law, William Carr, took the place of pastor of the First Baptist Church. Reverend Carr and his wife Ellen had 10 children. One of his children was Joseph Carr. Joseph Carr was also a veteran. He served in the military until 1952. After Reverend Carr, Reverend Raymond Allen Smith, the grandson of, as Mr. Bill say, Kibby, Reverend Smith took over as pastor of the First Baptist Church in 1990, and he's currently still pastor. Right, so St. Bernard has supported the military. Several people of color, several African American descent joined and served distinguishedly. Although it may have started as a way to be free, they've given their lives to the freedom of this country. Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any questions or input? Yes.
I just want to correct one thing. In between Sam, I believe, baptized me, and Pastor Raymond Smith was Pastor
Carr?
Pastor Jones, Clarence Jones.
Yes.
Was in between. So I just want to make sure that he's recognized. He died on the post of serving as pastor. I think he may have only served maybe 2 years. I do know it was in between because it was during my lifetime, but I don't know like the exact year. He definitely served. It wasn't long.
So First Baptist has had 4 pastors. It was Pa Sam, Reverend Sam Smith, Reverend Carr, Reverend Jones, and then Reverend Smith, Raymond Smith. All right, any other questions, comments? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Garland, for everything. And I think that you could see that we were able to touch on highlights tonight. You know, this was an overview. This is in no way meant to be a definitive presentation on the history of Verrettville. But I think with the work that Garland has, the work that other people have done, like Tony Fernandez, you know, to contribute to this documentation, obviously you're very knowledgeable. I think one of the things that we should try to do from now on is to really work towards putting together a narrative of the history of Verrettville and get it as documented as we can, because what's going to happen when we have the next Katrina? We just don't know what's in store for us in the future. And Verrettville is so important. And again, you know, you look at the business people. Garland's a business person. Others in this audience who are from Verrettville have been in business. You've had the people with Praline Connection, all of these great people who have been so important in the business community of the metropolitan region. So that the original intent of Verrettville, in large measure, was realized in that the enslaved and their descendants were able to transition from the horrible status of enslavement to freedom. And not only did they become free, but many of them became very successful educators, business people, professionals, people who were active in trades. I mean, very, very important. So all of this is so important to understanding, again, the complexity of the diversity of our history. And I'm delighted to say that, God willing, in February, we will have Pastor Smith come here to talk about Verrettville and the church. And of course, that will be during Black History Month. So we're going to continue to emphasize this history that's been forgotten. You know, I can remember many years ago when I started working on the Isleño history, the history of the Canary Islanders, those people from Spain's Canary Islands in the Atlantic off the coast of Morocco. And I had so many people tell me, well, how are you connected to those terrible, trashy people? And those people don't have any history. They don't have any culture. Well, guess what? We do have a history and we do have a culture. And we've been sharing that, and we've been working with the Filipinos. They had a wonderful festival this year, the very first one in Louisiana. And remember, Filipinos have been here since the late 18th and early 19th century. Asians. So there's a lot of diversity here, a lot of stuff for us to celebrate, to embrace, and to document, and then transmit to this generation and succeeding generations. So Garland, I thank you so very much. You're such a gentleman. You know, he's had many family gatherings at our museum complex. And of course, you know, I just love their food. We always said the Verrettville people were the best cooks in the parish. So, and then his mother's here. And Gladys, why don't you stand up, honey, and let them see you. And I want you to know, for years, Mabel and Gladys and Garland and Garland's mother, they've all been coming to help us during museum days. And I think that we're making small steps, but nevertheless, important steps that represent progress. So thank you all so much. Do you have any questions that I might be able to answer? Yes. Yes, Pa Sam, the original Mr. Samuel Smith, is indeed buried in that cemetery. And it's very interesting. He came from South Carolina here with Stephen R. Proctor. And Stephen Proctor had been at Sea Island in Georgia after he was in South Carolina. He had fought in the War of 1812, and they were some of the descendants of the elite planter class in the Carolinas. And they made their way west because there was so much, they thought, so much opportunity to make even more money planting sugar. So the Proctors actually established the largest working sugar plantation in the parish of St. Bernard prior to the American Civil War. And then, you know, as we trace back the history of the Proctor plantation, Stephen R. Proctor purchased the plantation from Pierre Denis de la Ronde, and then he had purchased it from Bernard de Marigny, and it changed hands several times, but it first became the property and recorded history of the Louisiana colonial period of someone named Pierre Thomas, T-H-O-M-A-S. Pierre Thomas, or Pedro Tomas, had been an enslaved African from the Congo, and he was able to purchase his freedom from his enslavers. He fought in the American Revolution under the command of Governor Bernardo de Galvez and Governor Esteban Miro. You know, we have Miro Street in New Orleans. Miro, in recognition of his service to the Spanish crown in the American Revolution against the British, gave him, Pedro Tomas, in 1788, the plantation that was to become Proctor Plantation. Pedro Tomas was a contractor. The Congo black people, the people from Senegambia, they were fantastic builders. So he actually wound up purchasing enslaved Africans from West Africa in the 18th century, invariably he freed them if they didn't die. And by the way, Pedro Tomas even has a son, Jaime, who is buried in the original St. Bernard Cemetery. So he was very much a person here. He built Ducro Museum. We were able to prove that, which is part of our museum complex. But then, ultimately, he left St. Bernard. He went to Tremé and to the Faubourg Marigny in New Orleans and built many of the Creole cottages in those neighborhoods. And then some of his descendants became very prominent in the free-colored community, the Gens de couleur libre community in the city of New Orleans. So it's really a fascinating history that we have here, and I'm always so happy to be able to share it. And of course, I can just go on. I need to shut up. You know, I remember years ago, I was more or less compelled to sit through a mission that an English-born Jesuit from London gave. It was the Prince of Peace Church, and of course, you know, he was a Jesuit, and he was a fine speaker. And at the end of his presentation, he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we learned a long time ago that it's most important to be good, be quick, and be gone." So thank you all so much, and let's look forward to more learning and more experiences here. Thank you.